Welcome back to our event, to this last session. We're wrapping up this two-day discussion. We've had many elements in this debate and discussions regarding methodology, concepts, case studies. It's been 2 fantastic days of learning, of discussing different approaches. And I believe that at this point, we do have more questions, many questions more than answers. Because of the nature of the debate, the nature of the discussion, the differences between experiences and cases, and of course the question that we need now to think about, we need to address is, where are we going now with all of this? What future avenues of research are there to continue the path of the study of the role of businesses in peace, the role of business in the achievement of the development goals, and how businesses contribute to the solution in conflictive scenarios when we have dire humanitarian situations. And for this closing panel, we've got a group of fantastic panelists with different backgrounds who will be reflecting on the general issues of this debate, of these discussions that we've had, and obviously what avenues, what future trends do we have in terms of research. I'm going to be introducing you as you speak, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you will find the full bios of our panelists in the website at LSE Ideas. So you can go back to check who are we inviting in this panel. But of course, welcome and thank you everyone for taking the time of sitting here and discuss with us in this fantastic discussion that we've had. Also, thank you to spectators, to attendants for being here and sharing your questions, your ideas also on this debate. Just a note on logistics, remember that we have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So at any point you can pose the question that you want to make to either any of our panelists or to all of the panelists. We will obviously have a time to discuss in the end after all the panelists speak. I'm going to invite every panelist to give us some general ideas of what they think about this debate first, and then we will go deeply into discussion. So without any further ado, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating in this final panel and the final session of our fantastic event during these 2 days. And I want to give the floor to Karlos Pérez. Karlos Pérez is a professor of international relations at the EGOA Institute of Studies on Development and International Cooperation at the University of the Basque Country in Bilbao, Spain. It's a pleasure to see you again, Karlos. It's not the first time we meet in this kind of debates. So it's a pleasure to see you again, and welcome.
Well, the same, Óscar. Thank you very much, Óscar, and the rest of the organizers for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure, of course, to participate in this session. And the organizers ask us to contribute some final insights for future lines of research. And to start, I would like to go back to some of the points mentioned yesterday by Arlene Tigner and also by Jenny Pierce in relation to the utility or not of the theoretical framework of human security. Indeed, the concept has been criticized for being ambiguous, theoretically weak, and instrumentalized by the neoliberal agenda. I agree with many of these criticisms, but there are different visions of human security, and some of them, in my opinion, still are useful to carry out critical analysis of reality and also to inspire social and political transformations. So from this perspective, I would like to make 4 proposals in order to reinforce human security as a theoretical and operational framework. Many of them have implications for business and corporations in 2 ways, so that they do not harm human security and so that they contribute to promote human security. The first proposal is to reinforce the theoretical elaboration or basis of human security. it has been criticized for being theoretically weak. But I think that it could be enriched a lot with ideas provided by critical security studies such as post-colonial and decolonial studies, green theory, feminism, and so on. In this way, we could build what Edward Newman called the critical human security studies, with more capacity to carry out critical analysis and to promote social transformation. Sorry. My second proposal follows something also mentioned yesterday. I also see that it's necessary to decolonize the human security approach. Decolonial studies have questioned the traditional concept of security, but hardly have tried to reformulate the concept of human security, as far as I know. It has been criticized for being based on Western principles, specifically on the conception of an abstract human being, supposedly universal, taken as an individual and without considering its identity and cultural peculiarities. So decolonizing human security could have two implications. First, to pay more attention to the impact that identity and cultural diversity has on the conditions of human security and human insecurity, and also to the very different perceptions that people have about their own security and well-being. The second implication would be to go beyond the individual as the referent of human security and to assume a community human security approach. For the indigenous communities, for example, the life experience of human security can be understood only from their community relationships. My third proposal would be to incorporate the dimension of geographic scales, because to understand people's human security is necessary to take into account factors at three levels: the micro, the meso, and the macro levels. Regarding the macro or international level, we cannot forget, as Arlene Tigner said yesterday, that the current neoliberal, and I agree with this idea, that the current neoliberal system tends to generate inequalities and human insecurity for a large part of the population. Therefore, in this context, promoting human security is somehow palliative. At the meso level, let's say at the national level, there are many areas that should be analyzed and that can have to do with the relationship between business and human security. For example, companies creating jobs and respecting human rights, fair working conditions, the environment, the rights of indigenous communities to their resources, and so on. Also, I think there is another important point for analysis here. Human security requires public policies, so states need resources. Therefore, a crucial contribution of companies to human security is just to pay their taxes. And very often, we see that many companies, especially in the global south, avoid paying taxes. Tax evasion and tax havens should be studied as a cause of human insecurity. The third level is the micro one. As we have seen, human security operates locally. That's why I think that it would be interesting to further develop the theoretical territorial dimension of human security. In these terms, it would be interesting to continue with the theoretical elaboration of a concept which was promoted years ago by UNDP, the local human development, for example, exploring its application in the context of peace processes, as is the case in Colombia, for example. To build a territorial approach to human security, I think that it can be very helpful an emerging discipline, the critical geography of peace. It has different names, but this is one of them. Its departing point is that the space, territory, is not a physical container, but is a human construction based on economic activities, social relations, and even on our mental construction of the territory. So how we imagine and represent the territory, the cultural identity, and even religious values that we attribute to it. Therefore, for example, peace processes should be seen as a transformation and reconstruction of space, not only in terms of the use of resources, but also of economic and social relations. They should involve building spaces of peace with more just and equitable social relations. This territorial approach should take into account, for example, the need to build more egalitarian power relations at the local level and between different territories, for example, between the countryside and the cities. The promotion of certain types of companies, as, for example, cooperatives, or the so-called social and solidarity economy companies, which gave priority to vulnerable persons and local economy, and also the need to face prejudices, even racist beliefs coming very often from the colonial time, which generate discrimination on the part of the urban elites and public policies towards rural and indigenous populations. And finally, the fourth proposal is to strengthen the link between human security and environmental security or sustainability. The green theory and the studies on the Anthropocene are posing the need to overcome the traditional vision of humans as something separate from nature, as dominators of nature, in order to see ourselves as part of nature. Some even are formulating the concept of post-humanism to overcome this distinction. Perhaps it would be confusing and contradictory to formulate an approach called post-human human security, but I think that at least it's necessary to go deeper into the relationship between human security and the environment. And well, this is all from me. Thank you very much. I hope these insights may be useful.
Thank you very much, Karlos. I really like that you went back to the discussion that we were having yesterday between Arlene and Jenny Pérez. It was a great discussion, great conceptual discussion, theoretical discussion. I believe it gives a lot of ground, a lot of base to the debates that we were having afterwards. I do have questions immediately, but obviously we need to go ahead and raise these questions at the end. But I think your position is very interesting in terms of what do we do with the concept of human security? Is it really just a concept lost in the middle of books and theories and without any possible application? And you land on specific proposals that actually want to give this kind of concept any applicability in real world, I believe. So I appreciate that contribution. I really like that you touched on the discussion that we had yesterday. Fantastic discussion once again between Arlene and Jenny Pérez. So thank you very much, Karlos. Let me now invite Jana Hönke. Jana Honke is a professor of sociology of Africa at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. Welcome, Jana. Thank you for joining this panel. Thank you for being here with us. And of course, you are welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I hope you can hear me all fine.
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. So thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here, and my apologies for not having been able to follow through all the discussions you already had earlier today. We have just started our summer teaching term this week, so schedules have been a little bit packed. So, but I'm glad to be here, and I hope I can still contribute to the debate on companies and promoting human security and peace. So that's what I would like to focus on here. I would like to focus my remark on two issues I see as crucial for future research in this area and also activities more broadly, perhaps. The first is more reflection on the unintended consequences of the promotion of the business for peace agenda that has been quite prominent over the past years. And second, more engagement with companies from the global south, and I'm thinking especially of China and Chinese companies here, including engaging more diverse conceptions of what societal engagement by companies could be and what resources to draw from in engaging companies. So how can we move, in other words, beyond a rather Western-centric view we see oftentimes in the business for peace and the corporate social responsibility agenda? So first, let me speak to unintended consequences. In other words, this is about might we do harm while supposedly doing good, trying to do good. Well, this is relevant for companies, for working with companies on issues of security, peace, and conflict. It's a question, of course, we know super well from the aid and peace building literature. It has also been raised quite frequently with regards to the growing role of private military and security companies and public security provision. But indeed, it's relevant to collaborative approaches with multinational companies to address security, peace, and conflict as well. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a case I've been working on quite a bit, and it's an unfamously famous example, I would say, of such unintended consequences. And I will briefly try and explain here in the few minutes I have what I mean by that. As I've discussed in an article based on research in Eastern DRC, large mining companies there, some of them considered ethical. So that's the ones that do engage in collaborative initiatives with NGOs that have, for instance, joined the voluntary principles on security and human rights. So really, let's say, most likely, so companies that we would consider the most likely cases to contribute to human security or peace, that's the ones I looked at in that work. And I found that they still have a rather ambiguous role on the ground. And I think that's something very important not to forget and to further reflect upon what it means. So for one, those mining companies in the Eastern DRC often cause new insecurity and conflict, well, themselves. So they are the source of significant parts of insecurity and violence that local communities experience. People are displaced from agricultural land or lose access to artisanal mining pits they used to work, and are often left with no alternative livelihood options. And at the same time, those companies then are considered by the Peace and Business for Peace agenda as governance actors as well, to address the very same problems partly they cause themselves. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. So encouraging companies to build and strengthen conflict prevention and community engagement can certainly help reduce the harm or some of the harm they inflict on local residents in mining areas. But presenting companies as peace builders effectively may conceal their role in creating these same problems, conflicts, and social inequality. The second issue is that while indeed collaborative initiatives contribute at times to changing corporate practices, we need to be more reflexive about the broader effects and implications of approaches that promote companies as governors, peace builders, and the like. The Business for Peace agenda, I would hold, perhaps unintendedly, produces also larger companies in particular as legitimate authorities that take up public functions, public roles, despite their ambiguous and limited role as peace builders on the ground. Large transnational companies benefit from the symbolic capital, indeed, that collaborating with NGOs, for instance, or international organizations comes with. In the DRC, it led to their further legitimation as the only valuable business in town. The agenda thus effectively contributed to delegitimize alternative actors such as small-scale miners. So the problem that I'm trying to raise here in my comment is that the Business for Peace agenda risks to supporting the concentration of mineral revenues further in few hands, or the hands of the few, while little redistribution to ordinary citizens might happen, and at the expense of more decentralized business models that could potentially provide more local livelihood opportunities. So without denying the hardship artisanal or small-scale mining can come with, I think the task must be to create sustainable options for making a living for many. And I'm not sure that some of the Business for Peace agenda that focuses on engaging larger companies as a solution to problems always addresses that fully. My second point, or the second larger point for discussion I would like to put forward briefly here is we should engage more with investors and companies from the global south, and I think especially from China. China's going out strategy has led to an exponential increase in Chinese FDI, foreign direct investment, over the last few decades. In Africa, for instance, from 75 million in 2003 to 4.4 billion in 2018. Understanding how Chinese actors act and justify their practices in host countries and how they might be engaged in initiatives for peace and development has become, I think, crucial. However, there's a lot of uncertainty about how to engage Chinese firms, and I think especially with activists and affected communities on the ground. There's sometimes one-sided negative discourse about China and Africa, I would say, doesn't help either here. It glosses over the significant diversity of Chinese companies, large and small, central and provincial state-owned enterprises, private companies, companies with different experiences in outbound investment, etc. pp. There's some research on growing numbers of reports and regulations that come through from China, but I think that's research that scratches the surface and remains at the macro level of policy. Crucial questions on the ground, I think, include how do Chinese mining companies respond, for instance, to public protests or attempts to engage them in initiatives? Do they change corporate practices in response to such protest or engagement? Which strategies might be more effective in addressing a company that comes from a more authoritarian state as compared to other companies? In a project on Chinese and other global south large-scale projects in Africa that I do supported by the European Research Council, we collaborate with Southern Africa Research Watch currently to map such experiences by local communities and NGOs in the DRC and Guinea in order to find out more about those questions. So I think in that area I would like to see more work, but I'm also keen to hear from others who might have worked in that direction. I believe my time is up, so I will skip over my last point and hope that my two remarks can be fruitful for our discussion in this final session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jana, and thank you very much for taking time off your teaching in the summer and to showing up here so that we can hear you and your thoughts. Thank you very much for that as well. Thank you for raising these 2 points. I think they discussed really well with some of the panels that we have yesterday. We have people from business. We have a case country on Congo itself. We talked about Chinese companies as well. And there are some points that we can connect in this discussion. And we have people from companies in Mexico, for example, speaking about, you know, how the companies do their effort to contribute to the achievement of peace, the achievement of development. And I think this discussed very well with what you have pointed today. That first point is specifically of the unintended consequences. I think it's an issue that we need to discuss, and it obviously seems like a good future research avenue to discuss further the entire theoretical background in which we are debating this issue. So thank you very much for this point. I do want to hear your last point that you had there, but probably later in the Q&A we'll have the chance to hear on that little point that you were missing at this point. Thank you very much, Jana. Let me now bring and invite Ben Miller. Welcome, Ben. Ben is a principal at CDA Collaborative Learning Project in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He specializes in responsible business operations in fragile states. It's a pleasure to have you, Ben. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Óscar. And let me just start by thanking Mary and Vesna and colleagues and Óscar and colleagues at the Universidad del Rosario for organizing this and for providing the opportunity to talk. There's an enormous amount to say about all that has come before, which is a good sign, a sign of a productive conference. I also want to take things, I've had two academic colleagues precede me. I want to take things in a little bit of a different direction, but I'll try to connect with some of what they've said. And I think just to frame up my comments, I want to offer a little bit of an understanding of what I do professionally and what my institution does, just to kind of frame up the remarks that I'm going to make. So I work at CDA Collaborative Learning. CDA does learning projects that are completely non-academic. They very much focus on practice-related questions that come from practitioners in specific fields. And to Jana's point a moment ago, CDA was the originator of the Do No Harm framework that looks at the unintended conflict-related impacts of humanitarian organizations. A follow-on learning project that we did shortly after the Do No Harm project concluded was related to unintended negative impacts, particularly related to conflict of private sector companies. So to that extent, my experience relates very directly to Jana's concern about those issues. There's another learning project that we did actually together with Jason Maeklian-Venn of Peace Research Institute Oslo. He was a speaker yesterday in this conference, relating to business impacts on peace. I'm happy to take this up a little bit further in the discussion that follows. I totally agree with Jana's concern about that discourse and where it's going and what its implications are. And we can talk about our learning project. There's some interesting practical implications of that for the points that Jana was making. All to say, on the basis of those learning projects, we make an effort to contribute to public knowledge of good practice, which is to say, we try to develop tools and guidance that practitioners in those areas can turn around and use with adaptations to context and so forth in areas where they work. There's another area of practice that also kind of informs the remarks that I'm going to make today, and that is that we do also bilateral work with companies in a broad range of different industries, but a lot of extractives, some renewables where the conflict issues are very, very similar, also construction, commercial agriculture, and certainly what we know about conflict issues in those industries is relevant to almost any capital or land intensive industry that I might be able to think of in any case. Just a quick word about how we do this work that we do, lest you think that we're sort of consultants, strategy consultants for companies. Basically, our experience working in conflict-related issues suggests that conflict is driven by a broad range of different factors that may fit neatly, I don't know, I'm agnostic about this, under the umbrella of human security. But all to say, it comes from an accumulation of minor unaddressed grievances on the part of companies' stakeholders, people who are affected by their operations. Our engagements on a bilateral basis with companies are very much focused on understanding the perspective of those stakeholders, which we try to translate into operational sense and logic, that is to say, the operational sense and logic of the companies that we work with, to explain to them what they're getting wrong and what they're getting right, and to offer them some advice about how to mitigate unintended impacts on conflict. All to say, that's been a very interesting set of experiences. I should point out that a couple of things there. The areas that we work in are conflict affected by and large. There are already conflicts there. They're also characterized by significant state weakness and persistent governance failures. And these are contexts in which there are typically a range of different actor groups that have competing and conflicting interests, and in some cases, histories of tension and possibly violence between and amongst them. And I mentioned state weakness a moment ago. There's no party that's in a position to mediate or negotiate amongst all those interests to ensure that competing and legitimate interests are balanced. And Mary was asking, I think it was following the most recent panel, the one that preceded this one, how to synthesize all of those divergent interests? Well, the answer is really simple. You must sit and negotiate until everyone has agreed. It really is. And in fact, the Business and Peace Learning Project demonstrated that really abundantly. The success cases that we're aware of, which were, by the way, extremely hard to find, where there's actual evidence of some meaningful success, involve collaborative multi-actor efforts efforts by actors that are implicated in local and political economic issues. In some cases, I mean, they run the gamut. They can be local government institutions, different security actors, public and state and private security actors, the company itself, of course, community associations and civil society organizations, religious institutions, and so on. Anybody who's present really has to participate. I mean, the issue is, to Jana's point about companies being asked to govern, they can't do that by themselves. That's arguably grossly inappropriate, but also probably not a recipe for success. There needs to be a broad-based agreement across a broad range of different interests amongst a broad range of different actors within those contexts for a good outcome to arise. That seems pretty clear from our case studies. It seems pretty clear from other people's case studies that we're aware of. And yet, in case after case after case in our bilateral work with companies, we see companies that either don't see that problem or that issue, or they see it but they don't see their own connection to it, or they see it but they see it as somebody else's responsibility, typically the state's. But you know, if you're operating in the DR Congo, what do you expect the state to do with respect to these kinds of governance or remedy issues, for example? And all to say, they see it and refuse to act. So I would use that to kind of frame up what I see as really relevant research questions. I talked about multi-actor initiatives. I believe that's been part of Mary's group's framework for successful outcomes. We've certainly heard it through a broad range of the other presentations, with thanks to colleagues in Colombia who were quite specific about this. There's relatively little systematic study, at least that I'm aware of, about what makes a multi-actor initiative effective. There's a very interesting piece by the Foundation Strategy Group in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. That's Kramer and Kania, for anyone who's interested. But they do a lot of work in the United States. It's not clear that that their experience will translate very well to fragile and conflict-affected areas. And I think there's a pretty broad range of useful research questions that focus on the practical aspects of these kinds of multi-stakeholder initiatives. And things that I would be interested to know personally would be what relationship exists, if any, between successful collaborations, that is to say, ones that lead to outcomes that a broad range of stakeholders say are satisfying, and different factors that exist in the operational or practical environment. So in other words, if we can see that the context has XYZ characteristics and features, is there then a kind of corresponding process or collection of actors that we need to engage or involve in a multi-actor process for it to be successful? A second question to my mind is whether it's possible to, in contexts where we can see that there's a high risk that a business operation is going to drive or intensify conflict, is it possible to intervene as a deliberate project, but in generating a multi-actor sort of coalition for action that would include the company, but then also a broad range of other local actor groups? And if so, what characteristics does the intervening entity need to have in order to do that successfully? Again, going back to our case studies with PRIO and the Africa Center for Dispute Settlement, all the actors were local, but I mean, per the difficulty finding case studies to actually look at in detail, this may be a process that, and also per the frequency with which companies actually generate conflict in these contexts, it would be nice if these things would happen a lot more frequently. Is there a way to make them happen on purpose? And if so, what does that look like? There's a bunch of questions that also come to my mind with respect to individual companies. For every company in our pool of case studies in our Business and Peace learning project, that were actually taking action of this kind, there were tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, that were not, that were doing nothing, precisely nothing, or were securitizing their response to high conflict risk in ways that very likely increased risk to external stakeholders. I think would be very interesting to know at a systematic level with some kind of conclusiveness why it is that companies make a decision to engage, or why it is that they make a decision not to engage. And not only why, but also how. And that goes to how we might actually engage companies to bring them into this kind of initiative. We were talking yesterday a little bit about what level of the company do you talk to, which people do you engage, how do you get to a point where you're sitting at the table with someone who can actually make a decision about these things. But then also, how are different issues weighted inside the company with respect to the kinds of decisions that a company might make. Related to that, with respect to influencing companies to take certain courses of action or to avoid taking certain courses of action, I think there's also a lot that we don't really know about investors. I mean, to my mind, the only investor that manages to kind of systematically influence company practices is the International Finance Corporation, which has been extremely reluctant to acknowledge the existence of unintended negative impacts on conflict. They did so just late 2019, I believe they finally have a publication that even acknowledges this. Meanwhile, their own performance standards are not a conflict mitigation standard at all, not even a little. Other investors may also have a role to play. We know that there are ESG investors, for instance, that have their own reporting frameworks and so on, which companies suggest are extremely difficult to use and to integrate into their other practices. But all to say, what else can investors do? What else do they need to know in order to do that effectively? Our experience working at field level with companies indicates that the IFC performance standards are, of all standards of responsible business conduct, the one that is taken the most seriously by companies. The attachment of financial strings seems to be a very significant motivator of companies, whereas the risk of exposure to human rights abuses committed by public security forces doesn't quite have the same effect, although that's also something that responsible companies will and should take seriously. And a third area that to me is really important, and then Karlos, I think that will wrap up my remarks, at least for the moment. Sorry, did I say Karlos? I meant to say Óscar. That's my fault, Óscar. I apologize for that. Armed non-state actors. There's a lot of company experience, and unfortunately it's increasing and spreading geographically to suggest that armed non-state actors pose really significant challenges to companies. The evidence that exists about good practices with respect to conflict management when business operations occur in the presence of an armed non-state actor is pretty anecdotal. We've developed a couple of cases working in partnership with the Fundación Ideas para la Paz in Colombia of some really extraordinarily good practice by really leading Colombian companies, leading in terms of their capacity for this kind of really eye-openingly good practice. But what's not clear about the learning from those case studies is whether they would be relevant to armed groups that look nothing like the FARC, the ELN, or the AUC, in states that look nothing like the Colombian state, in contexts that look nothing like Colombian contexts. So the broader applicability of that is really unknown. And as I indicated, this is a really dire and urgent question for countries like Mozambique, for Libya, for Iraq, and so on. There's a really broad application there. That would be, to me, research that I would read in a heartbeat. And with that, back to you, Óscar.
Thank you very much, Ben. I think that you bring a very practical side to this discussion. Interesting what your company does, what the institution actually does. It's good to hear from that as well. And I think, as you mentioned several times, that you discussed really well with several of the debates that we were having yesterday as well, and today as well with Jana's points. also on the issue of methodology, which we were extensively discussing this morning, if methodology we can have one sort of methodology model for all cases, or how it is necessary to go with different methodologies according to each of the scenes. And I think that you touch on one of the key points that I believe is pretty much one of the great questions of the entire event. And it is how to synthesize all the interests of so many parts and so many actors in one strategy, in one project. And you mentioned the importance of negotiate in this case, and then we would have to go into the question if negotiations usually are fair, if they go as they want to go for all the parts and all the actors. So it's very interesting that you pose this kind of more practical perspectives into the debate, into our today's session. And I think it's very rich that you touch on all of these points. Last but not least, obviously, we've got Leda Stott. Welcome, Leda. Leda is a specialist on partnership and sustainable development at the Technology Innovation Center for Development in Madrid. It's a pleasure to have you here, Leda. Thank you for accepting the invitation, and please, welcome.
Thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you all for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Ben, I'm very much going to talk from a practitioner perspective. The center that I work for here in Madrid is very much organized around the principles of looking for practical solutions to complex problems. The differentiating factor being that we always work in multi-actor collaboration and across different disciplines. So my reflections and considerations going forward really relate very much to partnerships, to partnering, and to the processes that involves. A couple of things just to start with that I find interesting. First of all, Ben, you mentioned that it's quite difficult, and this is something that also was spoken about yesterday, to find information on what makes effective partnerships. I'm drowning in that information. I think the problem is that it straddles so many different disciplines that it's very hard to pull together and find in one place. But it is there. It's just a matter of doing extensive research to find it. Another thing that strikes me and resonated yesterday when Arlene and Jenny were speaking is that in the same way that there are questions around the terminology of human security, the same is true for partnership. The partnership has been accused of being kind of empty of meaning, that anything can be encompassed by the term. It's also been accused of being a kind of neoliberal tool by which the corporate sector can enter into legitimate government processes. So there have been huge concerns about it as well. And it's interesting that very similar ideas are reflected around the use of the term in the same way as human security. So I think it's important to highlight that and to try and look a bit more deeply at what we're talking about when we use this term partnership or collaboration as we often use now. And also perhaps to stress here that partnership is not, as Jenny said yesterday as well, it is not a quick fix. It is complex, it's messy, it's demanding, it's time consuming. As Oscar has just said, getting different partners to share diverse perspectives, ways of working, and come up with a cohesive strategy is an enormous challenge. And not easy to do at all. In fact, there are some of the colleagues that I've worked with over the years in partnership say, if you can find a way of addressing your problem that is not through collaboration, go for it, because this is such hard work. It may be easier to find more simple ways of doing it. And certainly I think it's important to highlight that it is not a panacea either, and that it is important to ensure that it is the right way of working and to address the challenge or problem that we are confronted by. So maybe this is quite important, perhaps to look at other ways of doing it before we come to partnering. And if they're not possible, and we do need the inputs and perspectives of other organizations, then to go for it, but to think very carefully about that choice first. The process of partnering, I believe, needs special attention. I think this has come out in all the interventions that we've heard over the last couple of days. Working collaboratively, or not working to a boss or in a hierarchy, you're working in theory in a horizontal manner in which there should be kind of equitable participation among those involved. So it's important to ensure that power dynamics are taken care of, or that they're watched, and they're always there, I think, but that we look at them carefully, that we find ways of maintaining engagement, particularly for those partners who may feel lacking in confidence through resource issues, through their position in particular contexts. And then there's something for me around accountability, that the process of partnering is about ensuring that what partners say they will do, they will carry through. So we need to think about how to do that. Some of the things then to reflect upon are, as has already been said, and I think Mark and Phil and today Alexandra and Marcel said it really well, there is not a one-size-fits-all model, that any kind of collaboration or partnership process must be tailored to specific and changing. I think contexts are dynamic and changing, and partnership needs to be tailored to that. And for me, this is not just about the operational locality or context and its different social, economic, historic, geographic features. It's also about organizational contexts, different organizations and how we work, their cultures and ways of being, and about individuals in their context, because partnerships for me are ultimately about people. And if we ignore that individual element and how organizational representatives are involved in these collaborations, we do so at our peril. And I think there's a very fine and sometimes complex interplay between those contextual levels of operational context, of organizational context, and of the individual within the organizations that are in theory involved, or the groups that are involved in partnering. And it's important to look at those roles as enablers and blockers and how they influence partnering processes. It's important, I think, to select partners carefully, and this has come up again over the last couple of days and something I'd like to reflect on, that we're partnering because we want the diversity of different resources, perspectives, ideas and inputs that we would not get if we were working alone. This is why we're doing it. And as part of that, and again, something that I think has come up and I'd like to bring out, is the expectations that we have of what inputs are delivered is important to look at. So there's often been a rather stereotyped equation of when the private sector comes in, it brings with it cash or funds. And we're seeing more and more that it doesn't quite work like that, that our expectations of what partners bring are often huge and varied, and that the private sector involvement, for example, may be around contextual knowledge, maybe around their networks, their supply chains, their expertise that they can bring into play. And this is the same for other partners as well. So it's quite important to look beyond kind of stereotypical views of what different partners may offer. And also to look, I increasingly believe that some of the more innovative and exciting partnerships I'm working with and the most effective are those where we have looked beyond the usual suspects or the accepted players and gone beneath standard umbrella groupings of public, private and civil society to really look at those that often fall off the radar. We talk a lot about different community groupings, both formal and informal, but I'm also thinking within the private sector, small businesses, business associations, chambers of commerce, other business coalitions, other partnerships. There are a whole range of different players that I think we need to consider much more and bring them into the equation. And then also, I think, and I'm relating this back to comments that have been made today and yesterday by Jackson and Jana, I think you also have touched on it. There is criticism around this idea of collaborating and concern about the fact that partnering may delegitimize the public sector. It's like stepping into a breach where the public sector should be. So I think as far as possible, it's important to ensure that state actors are involved. Sometimes this is difficult. difficult, particularly in fragile contexts or contexts where the public sector is perceived as corrupt. But in my experience, it's very important to keep them informed, even if they may not be active partners, but to keep the public sector informed in order not to be accused of delegitimizing the state and kind of encroaching on areas which should be the area where the public sector works. I've talked about this before, and I believe I did a small presentation for LSE Ideas on this a couple of years ago. I think that it's really essential when working in partnering to look at incentives, and over and above the common desire to work together and the common objective, that each actor or each grouping that's involved needs to identify, explore, and then share their different reasons for wanting to partner. If these groups and organizations are motivated, if there is a clear rationale for their involvement in the partnering processes, it is likely that they will deliver on what they've said they'll do, that they will be engaged, and that this needs to be at the forefront of any kind of collaboration. And it's not something that you just do at the beginning when you're selecting partners. It's something that I think is important to do throughout the life cycle of a partnership or a collaboration, a constant review of the incentives of the different actors for working together to see whether it's still kind of meeting their needs, and if it's not, what may be done about it. Okay? And again, it's this idea that this partnering process is not static, it's dynamic, and these incentives or drivers may change over time. Central to collaboration and partnering is this idea of it being inclusive. This has also been mentioned, and I was struck listening to Alexandra earlier about the importance of it being ongoing and inclusive. It's not something where particular partners, particularly community actors, come in at specific points. They need to be involved, and I think the idea of co-production, co-creation that is being used so much now is this idea of an ongoing involvement. So right from design through to implementation, to consolidation, to ending, and to review. This idea, I think it's Richard Sennett, the wonderful sociologist who's written a book that I wholeheartedly recommend called Together, who says the nub of cooperation is active participation rather than passive presence. And I think this idea of ongoing involvement is essential, and it does involve experimentation and testing. So there is something here that I think is about license to fail, or learning from what hasn't worked very well and being brave enough to recognize it's not very well, and use that as a way of improving. So it forms part of this ongoing way of learning and developing and improving and coming up with effective solutions and effective ways of working. A couple more points and then I'll end. One, in relation to Janine's presentation earlier, I was very interested in the tool around trust building. In my experience, more often than not, unless partners have worked together before, trust is not likely to exist between them. Trust is something, in my experience, that grows by working together. So as the different partners come together and as they deliver, they generate a kind of mutual respect because they're putting in the resources or bringing in the ideas and expertise that they said they would, and they're delivering on the commitments they have made. And that really is the building block, this mutual respect, a building block for the trust that can eventually emerge. So it's perhaps a different way of thinking about it, because I don't think you can expect it to exist at the beginning of a relationship. It's something that is likely to grow over time, and the longer you work together and know one another, the more that is likely to develop. Effective collaboration, as has been said, relies on particular skills, and I think kind of what has been touched on in this idea of who does this, who brings together the different partners, is around a lot of the work that I do, which is this role of what I call a partnership broker or facilitator. And I have to say that in my experience over the many years I've worked in this area, the role of this figure, and it can be an individual or an organization, it can be both, it can be a mixture, and it can change over time, is central. neutral. This is somebody or some entity that is perceived as a neutral partner. So, for example, the centre I work with takes on this role as a kind of intermediary because perhaps it's an academic play that's seen as trusted by many of the different players that are involved. And they're able to facilitate and often shape the nature of the collaboration, ensuring everyone is heard, promoting engagement, providing transparent information, ensuring accountability and responsiveness that is also essential and again has been mentioned in relation to the partnering processes. And then finally, I'd just like to end on perhaps something that often people, when I mention this, people think I'm being slightly controversial, but I'm wondering if partnering should be a transitional mechanism, that it almost is too much to ask because of the incredible energy and resource input that it requires to function well, and time too, that what we need to be doing is trying to internalize these ways of working. So as well as the results, we're also trying to ensure that we institutionalize forms of collaboration within our organizational cultures, within our policies. The link between practice and policy is crucial here, so that these ways of working become part and parcel of what we do. And as they're institutionalized, we then don't need the partnership anymore, because we've kind of achieved what we wanted to do, and this is how we work, and it's become part and parcel of, I don't know, say daily practice and ways of working. So just something to throw into the mix about the idea of this being as a partnering being a transitional mechanism, that as things are institutionalized may make it unnecessary. And I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leda. You have actually made quite a good synthesis of the entire event, touching on several key points that we have discussed through several of the conferences yesterday and today. And I think that you raised some very interesting points, very key points to the debate. Once again, touching back on the meaning of concepts, the meaning of words. We were having a discussion this morning in terms of the concept of positive peace, of human security as yesterday, and the word partnership comes up. And then there's a discussion about if this has or doesn't have any meaning, if we should consider it a transitional mechanism. I think that's a very interesting discussion as well. And obviously the concept of inclusiveness, which comes up as something relevant that Alexandra touched as well, which I think it's also key to the debate. So thank you very much for that. We have some time for questions. There's a couple of questions. There's one in the chat box. There's another one in the general chat box as well. But let me abuse my condition of a chair to raise one particular questions that I want to hear in terms of the concept of human security. I would like to ask Karlos about this. We've been discussing about human security yesterday, today. And you have a good proposal in terms of how do we bring this to practice? How can we actually make it practical itself? I'm just wondering if, and maybe you've heard this question many times, but I'm just wondering if, isn't it better to just discard the question of human security itself and think about other concepts that we have today, like, I don't know, citizen security, seguridad ciudadana, which is a concept which is popular in Latin America. I don't know if we should try to focus more on other kind of concepts that seem to be more practical instead of human security, which seems to be quite wide. It has obviously all the debates on the theory level. If it's Westernized, it's not Westernized. Is it prioritizing the action of the state itself? Can it really be made practical in terms of empowering the individual? I don't know. Should we just focus on other kind of concepts that exist in the literature, like, for example, citizen security? We could think of others like democratic security, but that's going to be highly politicized in several countries, including Colombia. So I was just wondering, Karlos, if you would think that this is a better idea, to just focus on other concepts that seem to be more practical than the general idea of human security.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, this is one of the debates, and this is why a part of the critical security studies refuse the human security concept. Well, this is one of the reasons. The problem is which are the other concepts we could use instead. Citizen security, for example, it has a lot of connotations, I think, and probably more. I'm not sure, but well, I think it's something different and probably more conservative than the proposal of human security as it's understood by certain progressive actors involved or scholars involved in around the human security. Democratic security, for example, I think this is another one you mentioned. Well, it's very much focused on the political dimension of human security. And we have to take in account that human security comes originally from the idea of human development proposed by UNDP. So one of the interesting things of human security is that it embraces a lot of dimensions, an economic and social one, a political one in terms of political participation, an environmental one, and health, food security one, and so on. So this makes it very wide, ambiguous, probably vague, as it's criticized, but also very powerful in terms of making a good integral analysis of the situation. So you referred twice to something more practical. Well, this has been something defended by several scholars working on human security, that the wide approach of human security, the original one promoted by UNDP, was not practical in terms of doing analysis and promoting, inspiring policies. And this is why a new understanding version of human security appeared, a narrow approach to human security in order to make it more practical, more useful in political terms. But in my opinion, this idea of making it more practical had a problem, and this was to lose their transformative capacity to make integral analysis and promote transformative policies. So a part of the so-called, well, the critical security studies think that human security should be abandoned because it's instrumentalized by the neoliberal agenda, and because of, well, many of the problems yesterday and today we have been discussing about. The problem is, well, if we get rid of this concept, what other concepts with the similar powerful capacity to understand the reality at many different levels can we use? And this is the problem. I think that before we abandon a concept, we should have better proposals, and I don't see them. So this is why I and a part of the critical security scholars defend that human security has a lot of problems, but it can be enriched by different ideas, concepts provided by the critical security studies in terms of gender, in terms of decolonizing the concepts, in terms of environmental aspects, and so on. So in my opinion, there is a lot of work, a lot of theoretical work to be done in order to enrich human security, because I think it still is useful as a theoretical framework, but also as a political framework. This is my academic position about it, and political one.
Good, great. Thank you, Karlos, very much. I really wanted to hear your opinion on that one. Very good. Okay, we've got 3 more questions. Let me see if we can actually fit them in the time that we have. There's 2 a bit more practical, 1 a bit more theoretical. Let me begin with one of the practical questions. It's right there on the chat box for the panelists. As you will see, it's Christina Bash from LSE Ideas. Maybe Leda and Ben could try to answer this question. We know context matters, and the business community is extremely diverse and represents companies of all sizes, composition, formality, and sector. Practically, how can companies marry the various compliance-oriented agendas, including ESG and human rights due diligence, with human security and business for peace perspectives? So I'm thinking about Ben and Leda, but obviously if someone else wants to jump in, please feel free to do so. Who wants to go first, Ben?
Christina, I'm going to hold this against you for your information for the future. How can they marry that? Yeah, I think the way human rights has up to now been framed, and human rights due diligence has been framed. Really, the focus is on engaging and getting input and information from external stakeholders in order to define practices of the mitigation of risks that the operation itself exposes those stakeholders to. That's part of the human rights piece. There's been a little bit of a redefinition of that in terms of the reframing of heightened due diligence in a report by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights last year, which talks about the need for conflict-sensitive business operations and conflict analysis as a kind of framing of human rights duties and obligations. I think there's probably, from the standpoint of marrying these 2 things, at least a couple of different points to make there, or these different aspects of practice. One is that as a precursor to, or as an indispensable condition of any good outcome, especially in a fragile and conflict-affected context, there's not any such thing as too much external stakeholder engagement. So with respect to standard human rights due diligence processes, the extent to which the company is engaging stakeholders, that engagement can serve a broad range of different purposes, and can certainly be foundational to conflict analysis, for example, and the construction of stakeholder relationships that might form the basis of a partnership development and needs identification and those things. Yeah, I mean, I guess that for me would be the thread that might hold all of these different things together, would be that before any action has to be taken, there has to be a sort of sufficient analysis of the problematic that the company faces, the dynamics of the context, the institutional actors, and the way in which they relate to one another, and the risks that are going to be part of that scenario. I mean, to my mind, in all honesty, what that looks like as an operation, as an operational practice, at the operational level in the context of, let's say, a solar power, a solar field development project. That depends enormously on what the context is, on what the project consists of itself. I mean, somebody was saying earlier, there's no off-the-shelf recipe that can be applied here, and I would agree with that. I think that seems just abundantly clear. Some part of those analysis processes that are necessary as part of sort of understanding conflict dynamics and actor mapping and understanding human rights risks and so forth needs to be focused on thinking through what kinds of opportunities may be present on the basis of all of those other factors. I think, to be honest, I'm more concerned with the capacities of the company and how it makes decisions than I am with the fact that if one takes these individual processes as discrete processes, that it looks like they have to juggle a lot of different balls at the same time. Would be much more concerned with what the company makes of how it understands its own presence, particularly in relation to conflict dynamics and relationships between different actors, and then how it understands its own role vis-a-vis the opportunities that it may have to both work in ways that are purposefully intended to mitigate conflict risks, but then also to take advantage of or expand opportunities to have good outcomes. I hope that's a reasonable answer to the question.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for that reply. Leda, do you want to add something up?
I mean, I echo completely what Ben has said. I completely agree. It's about engaging with different stakeholders, and I do think it comes from the heart of the company. I'm wondering, in some of the work I've done, it's and again, it's very, very context dependent. It depends on the nature and the size of the company or the business or the private sector initiative. But there is something for me around starting at the center with how the CEO or directors see this, and really positioning that at the center, and then kind of a ripple out effect to the workers, how workers are treated and involved in this equation, then moving out to the marketplace, to supply chains, to communities, which is perhaps where the CSR piece comes in. I was a bit taken aback yesterday that we were just referring to CSR when we talked about this, because for me CSR is rather not used anymore in the companies we work with. It's much more corporate citizenship is what we do. CSR is something that is rather outdated. Companies are talking much more now about sustainability as part of their DNA, that it's more central to how they work, and this is what they're trying to position. And it's about working across all these different levels, including, I would say, beyond the community and in their discussions with the public sector around an enabling environment for the way they work and promoting peace and human security. So I think there are lots of different levels to work at, but I would agree with Ben, absolutely, it's highly context dependent.
Great, thank you very much, Leda, as well, for your opinion. We've got another question for Jana. Well, there's been kind of a discussion already online between Mark, who presented the DRC case yesterday. But maybe, Jana, you want to raise something to the public in general. The question is, Mark is curious to hear the answer to your research question, the most effective strategies to engage with Chinese companies, and to what extent is there a difference with engagement strategies with other Western companies?
All right. Yeah, thank you, Mark, for the question, definitely. So what I responded in the chat was that first of all, I was super keen to read up on Mark's case study that apparently I missed yesterday. And then, of course, I was talking about where we are. So we are about to start that collaboration. So as soon as COVID allows, we will have people interviewing systematically on the ground. So we are mapping. So the attempt is to systematically map the strategies and to compare in terms of if what works, what doesn't, among the evidence we find on Chinese firms, but also compare to how strategies work with regards to other companies from other national backgrounds. So that's why I'm very keen to engage with them, anyone, and have further conversations who might already have some case study evidence here, which is actually hard to get on Chinese companies, I think. And the other thing I answered was, well, so far we have been working a lot on mapping and conceptualizing, empirically mapping and conceptualizing different conceptions of what responsibility would even mean for a Chinese company. So we're trying to trace the different sources or moral orders in the context of which Chinese practitioners work who implement Chinese projects on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's what we have. That's what we have been able to do more so far, and maybe more broadly protest strategies without the interviews yet. And that, by the way, would have also been the point I didn't make at the end of my presentation. That I feel that I think that there's a tendency with the strategies to look for. So there is a one-size-fits-all approach at times that I think is very much focused on what some people have called explicit corporate social responsibility. So very, very much linked to a liberal global governance idea and way of dealing with things. And I don't think you can easily. Or that's the whole story. So I think we are missing out on other sources of how other actors think about responsibilities and that I think has implications for how you can engage. If you can understand worldviews by others, then I think that's helpful. That's not an argument for saying, well, the Brazilians and the Chinese are all different. It's all about cultural distinct, billiard balls that can't talk to each other. That's not what we mean. But we do see that there's a variety, there's a repertoire of how actors make sense of what they do and justify their presence. And I think that's a need for Chinese practitioners as much as for others. Even though we can't just, I think we can't just take the models of, we criticize the company towards a democratic, so we address the democratic public of consumers. And then that will reflect back on the company badly. And so that's how we put pressure on companies. So that's, I think, something that's very often used in with companies from the more democratic context. I think that doesn't work with just every company. So I think we need to think different strategies, depending also on what's the worldviews and the backgrounds companies come from.
Thank you very much, Jana, for answering that. I was actually going to ask you, so brilliant that you actually touched on that point as well. Fantastic. I have another more academic question, so I'm going to direct it to you and to Karlos as well. It's by Mary Martin is asking, how do we avoid, particularly as academics, falling into a binary trap that business is either framed as a conflict driver or is the great hope for new forms of I lost the chat. I'm sorry. Wait. Get lost in the chat. The new. Oh, Jesus Christ. Sorry.
Oscar, will you allow me to say it?
Please go ahead, Mary. I got lost in the chat.
Sorry, everybody. My Q&A wasn't working. So I was keen to hear from both Jana and from Karlos, maybe. How do we avoid this trap of the binary sort of framing that business is, particularly for research purposes, either framed as a conflict driver or this great hope for new forms of development and peace? And I wondered, particularly for Karlos, whether something like critical human security could contribute to conceptualizing and exploring, if you like, some sort of middle or common ground between those extremes. That was my question. Sorry for butting in.
Thank you, Mary. You saved my life. Thank you for saving my life. So who wants to go first, Jana?
Yeah, perhaps I leave more room to Karlos. So just quickly, I think one of the things to do, so I will not talk to critical human security conception, but to the other side. I think one of the first steps is to really differentiate or move beyond speaking about business or companies as such, because they're so different, with so different backgrounds, different abilities, different interest in engaging, different size. I think size matters quite a bit. And it's a bit odd to kind of just lump everything together, whether you engage the small family-owned company as much as the super large multinational, whether you engage a company that has lots of small-scale competitors or just, a company where it's simply you need a large company to do the business. So I think really differentiating whom we are talking about and not doing these, it's either or, so to say. I think that's useful.
Great. Thank you, Jana. Karlos?
Well, to be honest, it's a very challenging question to me, because usually I don't work on human security from this perspective of the linkages with business and corporations and so on.
Karlos, I think we're not hearing you well, or I don't know if it's only me, but can you speak louder?
Can you hear now?
A bit more.
Maybe it's my microphone. I don't know. Sorry. Can you hear me? No?
I don't know the rest. I can't hear you well. Can you, Jana, can you hear him? Yeah? Okay, go. Cool. Go ahead.
Well, so on the other hand, I think that the critical human security studies are to be built. I mean, it's not a concept that is widely accepted, and I would say that most of critical views on security try to refuse human security as a concept. So it's a minority of scholars accepting inputs and insights from the critical security studies to be incorporated in order to be incorporated to human security. And so the question is very challenging. I should reflect about it. To be honest, for me, I am a little bit reluctant. This was my departing point about this debate. I am a little bit reluctant about the contribution that global companies, transnational companies can do in order to promote human security. And this is why I have learned a lot these days, knowing about or listening about your experiences with different organizations, with different companies. But well, my first aim would be to refrain corporations from damaging human security, to be honest. So not to create, in order not to create human insecurity. But I have learned these days that there are many spaces to work with them, to make them aware of the need to respect working conditions, equality, human rights, and so on. On the other hand, as Jana said, there are many different, a huge variety of companies, enterprises, and some of them, I think they have more capacity to be involved in human security processes. As I mentioned, for example, cooperatives. Here in the Basque Country, we have a lot of tradition and experiences in the field of cooperatives. Some of them are being translated to the peace process, to the reincorporation process of ex-FARC guerrilla members in Colombia, for example. So there are many kinds of corporations with different values, with different attitudes towards vulnerable people, to making profits, and so on. And I think that some of these kind of corporations or companies could be well promoted, especially in post-conflict processes. I don't know. Sorry, Mary, I cannot elaborate more my answer, but well, my feeling or my view now about this topic is more flexible, I can say, than it was 2 days ago, thanks to this seminar. I think I have incorporated a lot of doubts and new views about this idea, probably full of prejudices I had previously.
Great. Thank you, Karlos, for that. Fantastic. I appreciate that a lot. Okay, I think we have time for a last question. It's also there on the chat for panelists, and I believe that we can have, well, maybe the practitioners, but if the others want to jump in as well, could be interesting to hear you. At the core of human security approach is community empowerment. Are the company community engagement practices actually capable of doing it or not, and why? So I don't know who wants to address this. Maybe Leda and then Ben.
Okay, it's a great question, and it depends. I'm sorry to keep having to say, well, it will depend. It will depend on the context and the company. And in my experience, this is where it is often not enough just to have it from a company. This is where this facilitator role that I talked about before comes into play. So often this trusted broker, if you like, with trusted partnership broker, who is able to make the community connections. I have seen cases, I'm thinking of, for example, the work of Rio Tinto in Madagascar, where they really developed a strong community engagement process because they had been burnt in previous development projects, and they wanted to exploit a mine in this area, and they began their work, I think it was 16 years beforehand, with very strong community engagement, community empowerment processes. And because of contextual reasons that were not actually to do with the company, there was a coup d'etat, so it all got very complicated. But what they did do, and I think was very useful, was they used these facilitators, advisory panels from different organizations of society that would help promote that. So there was a kind of multi-stakeholder approach to positioning that connection with the community. And I just also like to make reference to the work I'm doing at the moment. This is more in Europe with the European Commission. There is a very strong interest in community-led local development, which is why on earth are organizations saying that they should be doing the empowering? It should be bottom up, and that much more attention needs to be paid to how it is done locally, to getting local leaders and organizers and enablers to push that forward. So something around that needs to perhaps be looked at much more deeply.
Thank you very much. Ben?
Yeah, I thanks for that, and thanks for the question, Vesna, and Leda, thanks for that response. And I agree completely with everything you were just saying. I mean, I think my answer would also be, it depends. All sort of large capital or land intensive enterprises are going to do stakeholder engagement, but they're not all good at it necessarily. What does good mean? I mean, good can mean a lot of different things. I think the sort of terms that we adapt from one context to the next, depending on the company and the nature of the context, is early and ongoing and broad and inclusive. That's certainly an important element of it. There's a second aspect to this that's equally important, which is the company through those processes needs to understand itself to be both gathering information from a broad range of sort of corners, if you like, of the social field where it's situated. Also building relationships. This is companies often, at least the companies we work with, they're full of engineers and lawyers. They have a very kind of linear logocentric view. We need to get information about X in order to make a decision about Y, but they tend not to see that the nature of their relationship with the community itself, or with different segments of the community, as being a kind of cumulative process that builds on itself. So it doesn't really have a linear, or at least not a transactional reality, let's put it that way. I think another sort of point in all of that, but one quick side note actually before I turn to my sort of final part of this response. The case study that I mentioned about effective operations in the presence of armed groups from Colombia, from the operations of the company Isagen in the Tolima department in Colombia. That company engaged communities that were living in an area under the control of the FARC for 2 years before they moved a single shovelful of earth in their project. And that's almost unheard of, really, especially for a hydropower project that was not going to involve dam construction. Most extractive industries companies, there's a highly elaborated process of exploration, which starts with very low impact sort of seismic sonographic activity, but they view their community engagement as the process necessary to get permission to do sonographic activity. And they really shouldn't view it that way. They should view it as the process of putting in place the relationships that are necessary to sustain this project over its 10, 20, 30, 100-year life. I point to the Isagen case as a real example of this. There's a second aspect of community engagement that has to do with what the company does with the information that it receives and how it positions itself relative to stakeholders. Companies need to give up real decision-making power about issues that affect communities, and they need to hand those decisions off to probably a kind of multi-stakeholder body. I mean, the company needs to be able to respond to things that it can and can't do and so forth that are requested by the community. But it also needs to, it needs for communities to be and see themselves as being in charge of making decisions about things that affect the community. That is not something that, I mean, that you could, if you use the term stakeholder engagement broadly enough, see that as an aspect of stakeholder engagement. I mean, the social development committee meetings and so forth would fall under stakeholder engagement activities, but it's that what we see as sort of bad stakeholder engagement is when the company takes information and makes its own decision without necessarily validating that decision or without putting it in front of a body that's consists of a mixed group of stakeholders, like the kind of advisory board that Leda was talking about in the case of Rio Tinto in Madagascar. So it's not enough. It's necessary, but insufficient by itself.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. I think we are out of time, but if anyone wants to jump in this question, I don't think it's a problem if we listen to you, or we can call it up. No one? Okay. Good. All right. So I think this pretty much brings us to the end of our session, of our panel, and obviously of these 2 days of discussion, of debate. I think it's been fantastic discussion we had today and yesterday. I think we have touched on a matter of subjects. It was a very rich discussion. One of them was obviously a conceptual theoretical when it comes to the concept of human security itself, and other concepts that can be associated to this concept as well. The idea of positive peace. We had a long discussion about this kind of concept, the use of words, the idea of partnerships. This is one of the lines of discussion, and obviously a future research as well. That there might be a lot of discussion coming up on this line. Then we also had a discussion in terms of models, the idea of can we actually find a model that can be applicable to many cases, or can we at least have several models that can be applicable to different types of cases? The idea of a one-size-fits-all, which was discussed here at this table and obviously through the day, is yet another point of discussion, and why not an avenue of future research. And obviously methodology. We discussed methodology profoundly, how to do it, when to do it, what are the good results, what are the bad experiences. The idea of the lessons learned coming up from these methodologies are actually also important, and was also interesting to hear so many perspectives about this methodology. And finally, I believe that we touch on the point of the business for peace framework as a framework. I don't want to say as a theory, but at least as a framework, because that allows us to discuss unintended consequences, for example, as Jana touched it. And this could be another point of discussion, future discussion, and future research to be done as well. So this brings us to an end. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Leda. Thank you very much, Karlos. Thank you very much, Jana, for taking the time to sit here. For the rest of the panelists in the rest of the sessions also, thank you very much. To LSE Ideas, to Mary and Vesna, thank you very much for letting us participate in this very interesting discussion. To everyone who was behind the scenes in the support for logistics, Dave, thank you very much as well. Juan Sebastian, thank you very much as well. I think it was a great discussion that we have here. Thank you, obviously, to the participants and the spectators for joining in the discussion and for being part of this fantastic event that we have during these 2 days. Thank you very much. Goodbye.